Want to welcome you back today to GLBC Connections. Today I want to look at Psalm 53. If you read Psalm 53 carefully and then read Psalm 14 carefully, you'll notice something that I think is quite interesting. They're nearly identical, almost word for word, with just a few small, very slight changes. In fact, often when I read this out loud, I'll tell people I'm turning to Psalm 14, and I'll read Psalm 53 and have people follow along and don't even realize that I'm reading two different Psalms. The reason I do that exercise and the reason I bring it to your attention is just to point out that the Psalms are not really just independent poems, but very often their place within the Psalter, their position, the way in which they're put together with other Psalms is, I think, generally intentional, not always intentional, but very often quite intentional. Certainly the case with Psalm 53, it follows on the heels of Psalm 52. Psalm 52 is a psalm of judgment, a specific psalm in which God lets arrogant and prideful people know who don't follow them what will happen to them in the end. And Psalm 53 follows that up, and it's a familiar one. And I want to read the first half of it before we see the second half. The first half goes like this. Only fools say in their hearts, there is no God. They are corrupt and their actions are evil. Not one of them does good. God looks down from heaven on the entire human race. He looks to see if anyone is truly wise, if anyone seeks God. But no, all have turned away. All have become corrupt. No one does good, not a single one. Will those who do evil never learn? They eat up my people like bread and wouldn't think of praying to God. In his retranslation of Psalm 53, Alec Maier renames the fool the spiritually unprincipled person. The idea here, I think, when he does that, is to highlight what the fool really is. Often, I think, in our language, we think of the fool as kind of the court jester, the person who runs around not paying attention, makes stupid decisions. But in fact, in the biblical sense, fools can often be quite successful by worldly standards. And yet they still say there is no God. And so we read this psalm often and we think of atheists. But I don't think that's quite the right idea. Rather, the spiritually unprincipled person very often believes in God, and I run across such people all the time in my conversations. They believe in God, but they live as if he doesn't exist. That's the spiritually unprincipled person, one who acknowledges God, but doesn't really acknowledge his control or his power over the life of the individual. I think we need to be cautious here as we quickly point the finger at others and rather reflect internally if we are such a person, one who believes in God but does not really put that into practice. Well, the interesting thing about this is the psalmist says there is nobody who is not spiritually unprincipled, nobody who leads well with their actions, nobody who is exempt from what this psalmist is talking about. Paul uses these very words in Romans chapter 3 when he talks about the plight of humanity, and he quotes these words and says there is no one who follows God, no one who believes in him, no one who follows Jesus Christ. And Paul says then in the end we're all born corrupt. And Calvin, on that same issue, he says, all of us, when we're born, bring with us from our mother's womb folly and filthiness, manifested in the whole life, until God makes us new creatures. This is the act of Jesus Christ coming into our life and making us new creatures, ones who no longer say there is no God, the spiritually unprincipled people who live as if he doesn't exist. It's only possible with faith in Jesus Christ. And I say that very strongly. Often we try to live that way without really putting our true faith in Jesus Christ. And here those of us who have professed faith in Jesus Christ, I think often pat ourselves on the back for how well we've done. But again, I think we need caution on this point. Because even us who acknowledge Jesus Christ and say we follow him, very often we show no difference. We do not act as if we are the new creatures. I think in our culture this comes up in a few ways. One is the rampant consumerism in our culture. Very often when I look at the church, I find us following the same path. using retail therapy, as it were, to make ourselves feel better, ordering things off of Amazon, filling our homes, worried about the square footage of our house or how nice it looks, or having the latest and greatest in appliances or furniture or cars or whatever else it might be. This, I think, is the consumerism that infects our wider culture, and I think is not really what new creatures in Jesus Christ are called to live as. Rather, we're to reject consumerism and put our hope and trust not in what we buy or own, but in Jesus Christ. I think we see it too in our individualism in our culture. We are people who, as I often say, pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps. Because of that, I think we're always a little reluctant to get as involved with the community, a close community of people, as we ought to be known by them and to know them, to care for them and be cared for by them. Because we are in an individualistic society, we tend to think we should do it ourselves and other people ought to do it themselves. And because of that, we don't fully commit sometimes to a community of believers as we should. I think when we're new creatures in Jesus Christ, He calls us into a new community, one that makes us known and one through whom we know others. And I think that's an important part of being a Christian. Paul makes that point so explicitly clear in many of his epistles to the believers in the early church in Corinth and Ephesus and Colossae. The third thing that I see is just a lack of forgiveness and bitterness, that we hold on to those angers, and I see this in many different ways. And I just think we live a bitter life, one in which relationships are broken and we just can't let go of it. I think, again, this is not the way of the new creature in Jesus Christ. He is one who has forgiven us much greater than anything that has been done wrong to us. And because of that, we really ought to be a people who are forgiving. Bitterness should not be part of the Christian's life, and yet often I find that it is. In all three of those things, I think very often we live as the spiritually unprincipled fool that Alec Motyer calls them. We say there's a God, but our lives don't show any difference from anybody else around us. The call then of Psalm 53 is to remind ourselves that we are to be new creatures in Jesus Christ, that we are not exempt, that we have been the fools, and we are called out of that life. And so in the end, the psalmist of Psalm 53 says, "Who will come from Mount Zion to rescue Israel? When God restores his people, Jacob will shout with joy, and Israel will rejoice." Who will come to rescue God's people? And the answer, we say, with great joy, great delight, and great excitement, is Jesus Christ. And so even as we say, everybody is stuck in this, everybody has been a fool, everybody has said there is no God, lived as if that's true, and yet God still calls his people out to be new creatures. That's our hope and our challenge. Our hope is in the fact that God has called us. Our challenge is to live as the new creatures that we're called to be. Thanks for joining us today, and we just always really appreciate that you spend the time with us.